If a firearm could choose its own gun oil, it couldn't choose a better lubricant than Ballistol. So smooth. So clean. Drinks it right on up without leaving that sticky buildup that some other gun oils do. Damn shame. Doesn't your firearm deserve the best? Ballistol, the gun's choice oil. Primer tested and trusted. Just a reminder, October is Spirit Month. The New School collection for 2025 is now available for pre-order. Remember, these designs are only produced once. Orders will not be taken after November 7th, so put your order in before you forget. Thank you for supporting our mission, and we hope you wear them with pride.
Hello class, I'm your professor for today, Professor Gruffudd. Today we'll be learning a little bit more about everyone's favorite big bore semi-automatic. This time, it's going to be the 1911 A1. Ooh, that's an upgrade. Dimensionally, this is much the same as our already well-explained World War I single-action, slide-operated, Browning tilting, short recoil locked, auto-loading pistol from our prior lesson. The look, however, is much changed. That's because this is a late war Remington Rand 1911. Overall length is as you'd expect, right at 8 1/2 inch. That's 22 centimeters, so not titanic, but hardly small. Weight is a whopping 2.4 pounds or 1.1 kilogram unloaded, and in that same case, at least you have a brick. The single stack magazine is detachable. Just use your right thumb without breaking your grip. It fits 7 rounds of the .45 caliber automatic Colt pistol cartridge around designed for government expectations. Now before we get too far into this lesson, don't forget the study guide from our last lesson should have already found your inbox, assuming you are a paid up student, that is. If you'd like to join us, just come on over to Patreon or Subscribestar. Hunker down, students of the gun, because it's going to take some time to get from, well, this World War I era 1911 all the way to this end of World War II 1911 A1. Let's start with just the briefest of recaps though. Previously we covered the whole lead up to this Colt model of 1911 as fielded in the Great War. We also delved into 1911s made by the Springfield Armory, again for the same conflict. And despite quite a few attempts, only one other producer provided 1911s during the Great War, that being Remington UMC, who produced the least standard of these big bore auto loaders. Now, as we know, the Great War wrapped up a little ahead of schedule. The Entente nations were planning a big offensive for the spring of 1919. Germany, however, was on the verge of collapse and signed an armistice in November of 1918. This hurried peace left a lot of embers glowing, and it wasn't entirely clear when or by how much each nation should disarm. Though by March of 1919, US ordnance was cutting way back. And it was clear that there would be no more large deliveries of pistols for holding in reserve. The slashing of the US Armed Forces meant that sufficient surplus was on hand for many years to come. Even so, the lack of fighting did allow room for a performance review for the 1911 pistol. Overall, it was excellent. Power aside, its form and function set the standard for basically all automatics to follow into the future. This does not, however, mean it was perfect. Several complaints persisted basically from adoption through the war. An almost complete list was given by the chief of the Ordnance Department technical staff in September of 1920. His letter to the Cavalry Board solicits their comments on a number of modifications proposed by a civilian pistol shooter by the name of Marcellus Rambo. Unfortunately, I haven't turned up much on Mr. Rambo, or at least his direct connection to ordnance. Some scant clues suggest, but don't prove to me, that he was the son of an American dentist who had relocated to Brazil. Marcellus seems to have studied engineering at the University of Georgia, graduating in 1904. In December of 1918, he lists himself as living in Rio de Janeiro, having abandoned engineering and taking up his father's trade of dentistry. This seems to fit with an older Marcellus Rambo of Rio de Janeiro, who is listed as an NRA Life member and has a smattering of letters sent into arms magazines in the 1920s, along with some winning scores in a 1921 pistol match. Now, I'm sorry I couldn't dig much deeper, but we only have so much time for me to prepare between our lessons, as we don't recycle these lessons. Rambo's suggestions were fairly tame. When firing the pistol, the web of the hand is often pinched, regularly to the point of bleeding. Why not shorten that hammer up? The trigger is too long to reach easily and apply good leverage, so we should shorten that as well. And, at least in Rambo's case, the slide fit is too loose. That should be tightened up. These issues were studied by the Cavalry Board, and in November of 1920, they responded. The first defect exists to a considerable degree and should be resolved. However, it should not be by shortening the hammer. Instead, the grip safety and the frame should be extended. The second defect was also found to be true, so no argument there. The third, however, could not be confirmed. They believed that Mr. Rambo's pistol was defective in this regard. Maybe he let it rust and then cleaned it up, and it was enough material to create play? The Chief of Cavalry then forwarded these findings to the Ordnance Department with a request to make these improvements. The department turned to Colt's Patent Firearms, who pointed out that they had actually recommended a smaller hammer from the start. It was the government who had extended it and created this pinching issue. Colts would be happy to extend their grip safety, but extending the frame would be much more expensive and mean abandoning parts interchangeability, so that concept was dropped. The trigger could of course be shortened though. While Colt was working at this, another recommendation came through. This time from then Lieutenant William Holmes Wenstrom of the Cavalry. Born in Sala, Sweden, he had immigrated with his father, a mining engineer. Wenstrom graduated Milton Academy before attending the Military Academy. Thanks to the war, he graduated twice. First in November of 1918, then recalled as a second lieutenant in the Student Officer Battalion, entering the Army as a second lieutenant, graduating again in June of 1919 and being assigned to the cavalry. After a tour of Europe, he was promoted to first lieutenant and assigned to Fort Riley, Kansas as a student officer at the cavalry school. Wenstrom apparently took note that new shooters of the 1911 had a habit of not taking a high enough grip on the pistol and had a tendency to aim low. This proved somewhat difficult to correct for some percentage of new shooters. He had found placing a hump on the mainspring housing tended to correct the behavior faster. The Cavalry Board considered they might just be onto something, and in February of 1922 they requested 10 modified mainspring housings. The Ordnance Department, however, went straight for 10 completed pistols with all the improvements, though not all at once from Colt. Instead, they charged Springfield Armory with modifying 10 existing pistols to the new standard. Shorten the trigger, extend the cone of the grip safety, extend the rear surface of the mainspring housing, and wrap it all up and give it back to us. Colt quoted a price of $100 each for their prototypes that didn't have the mainspring housing because that was a separate issue going on at the same time, so maybe Springfield Armory, you can get some parts from them. Take the lot and ship them to Fort Riley, Kansas for testing, which they did in August of 1922. In late November, the Cavalry Board responded with further requests. First, relieve some metal from the frame just above and behind the trigger on either side. Narrowing this out makes the shorter trigger easier to reach. Second, checker the mainspring housing at the rear to provide better grip. And third, checker the front face of the trigger, again for a solid purchase while you put your finger on the bang switch. During April, the technical staff of the Ordnance Committee reviewed the recommended changes and even considered the possibility of recalling and modifying all the pistols that were currently in service for alteration to the same pattern. This, however, wasn't really feasible for lack of funds, but if the cash were available, it would prove to be very simple to do. On April 20th of 1923, the improved model of 1911 was standardized as such. It wouldn't get an official designation for a few more years, though. On June 12, 1923, a contract was let out to Colts for the manufacture of 10,000 improved model of 1911 pistols for $26.50 each. 1,000 of this lot, by the way, should be specifically selected to be set aside for national match use. Now, none of the 10,000 came with any magazines, as there were already plenty in stock. Actually, a whole project was undertaken to assess the potential use of incomplete or unassembled parts left over by the tens of thousands following the Great War. Unfortunately, these were not manufactured to the specifications of the now peacetime Colts and would be more expensive to rework than to just pay for to be created new. Except, of course, those magazines. Ordnance inspectors at Colt saw that they were fitted to each new pistol as they were taken off the line, and in that way they managed to get a little recycling done. It was decided that the last serial number accepted by the government during the Great War was 629,500. To avoid any pains, Colt was instructed to begin the new model at serial 700,000, and production got underway without much delay. Now, completing the contract was another matter. A supplemental contract had to be signed in September, extending the delivery schedule by 3 months, because Springfield Armory's drawings included little details that would require hand-cut checkering on the trigger and mainspring housing. This was way too time-consuming and, of course, very expensive to do en masse. Colt's General Works manager negotiated to have the checkering done by machine operation. They also recommended ditching the grip diamonds. These uncheckered sections around the grip screws didn't really offer any extra strength, but prevented simpler, more rapid checkering at the factory. Now, all 3 changes were approved in September, but more followed in October. Colts was pushing back on the ordnance drawings. They wanted to conform them to their already ongoing commercial production, which featured many minor changes to various parts, again to speed up and simplify manufacture. There were, however, some improvements that were mixed in. Colt actually had eliminated the taper to the front sight, making it wider at the top and more legible. The rear sight was opened up a smidge and deepened. These sights had been tested out back in August of 1918. They were easier to pick up for most shooters, meaning faster acquisition. The idea came from former bare-knuckle fighter and now Colt's employee, John Henry Fitzgerald. Yes, the same man as the later Fitz Special revolvers. The previously round pin for attaching the front sight was also made square. Colt pushed to reduce the strength of the recoil spring, which made it easier to retract the slide. These and other little tweaks were approved in late October of 1923. Deliveries began in January of 1924, and what they got looks a lot like this. These photos, however, are from a pistol from this very first contract. Improved sights, longer grip safety, which we can't really see inside of, but has been improved to better engage the trigger. A shorter trigger, by the way, along with the relieved frame. Evenly checkered stocks, no diamonds. The manual safety is somewhat altered for better plunger action and easier manufacture. The slide stop shape has been changed, now easier to manufacture and sporting a longer checkered pad. The slide stop assembly notch is a bit shallower. Unseen to us here, the barrel dimensions and clearances have been improved. The recoil spring has been reduced by 3 turns and its wire diameter has been shrunk slightly. The same was true of the mainspring, at least for a short time. That's because during testing of those national match pistols, some ammunition with especially hard primers just wouldn't detonate reliably, so the mainsprings were all refitted back to original specifications. After these pistols entered service, it became apparent they needed a better designation than just the word improved. The question of what to call them was posed to both the Infantry and Aircraft Armament Division Manufacturing Services and the Field Service. The latter wanted to go with Pistol Automatic Caliber 45 M1. I suppose, in the long run, they'd get their way with so many other US weapons. But not this time, because the Manufacturing Service offered up Pistol Automatic Caliber 45 M1911A1, and the Ordnance Committee picked this solution May 17th of 1926. This designation applied retroactively. Any pistol over that 700K starting serial number was considered a 1911A1. Those under, even if later upgraded, were still 1911s. It was also decided that the designation should be moved from the slide to the frame on all pistols going forward. Take note, these early models were still marked Model of 1911 on the slide. In theory, the next batch should have this fixed, but it seems the matter was forgotten for well over a decade. That's because neither the Army nor the Navy ordered any more 1911A1 pistols until 1936, so not a very lucrative product throughout those Depression years for Colts, though they did manage to contract with Argentina in 1927. Previous adopters of the original 1911, Argentina now came to buy 10,000 pieces for their army. designated the A1 as their Modelo 1927. These were bog standard, but with Argentine markings. Also, it's fun to imagine for a time that the US government and Argentina had the same number of 1911 A1s. In November of 1935, the Navy requested 1,580 additional M1911A1 pistols from the Springfield Armory. However, they could not fill the order with new pistols, so that order was eventually put in with Colt. This was delayed because of government spending was still very low at that time, and they first sought to overstock with an order for 5,000 when they went for appropriations. Instead, 2,349 were purchased with what money they were allowed over several small contracts starting in May of 1936, followed by April and June of 1937. 1,580 were, of course, for the Navy, and the balance were retained by the arsenal for future dispersal. Apparently, magazines were also running out because 3,044 were ordered for the Navy from Colts at this time. At the start of the same contract, another change was made to the 1911 A1, and it's something we've seen before. Handguns tend to wear out right around that firing pin hole on the breech. This zone near the primer is better served by hardened steel, which isn't the best for the whole slide. So they bored out what would be the firing pin hole and screwed in a hardened steel plug, which was then bored out for the firing pin. Now, the government actually wanted this pressed in place and even tested to see if failures of a pressed in plug were likely. Despite being deemed fit, they actually caved to matching Colt's civilian production in this matter. Fun fact, the ordnance drawings were not updated until September of 1942, well after that plug was standard. Now, pistols from this contract era, not 42, but 36-7, also have the serial number marked underneath the firing pin section of the slide. That would later go away. It was just carried over from Colt's commercial production habits. These pistols were still not yet marked 1911 A1 on the slide, or on the frame rather. They were still marked 1911 on the slide. In 1938, 1,296 more pistols were ordered, and since they finally updated the drawings to include the correct 1911 A1 markings, these pistols are actually the first to be marked correctly. Just to show you, that's model 1911 A1 on the frame instead of 1911 on the slide. The Navy attempted to follow suit in October of 1938, but delays pushed this into early 1939. Over 4 small orders, they would receive 3,636 pistols, which exhibit a slightly shortened hammer spur, now returned to almost exactly the profile originally adopted on the 1911 that the government had changed. And while we're counting, a late 1939 order from the Army arrived in 1940. Combined with a mid-year additional order, we get 4,693 total. All this is just to say that the US was basically walking the line of minimum order all the way into 1939. In September of that year, Britain would enter the new European conflict that erupted into the Second World War. Following their withdrawal at Dunkirk, they found they had abandoned a majority of their arms supply. The shortages were now extreme, and there was rampant fear that Germany would invade England directly. Without much in the way of legal private firearms ownership, there was a great scramble for anything that could shoot. Even if it wasn't standard, if it came with ammo, it could be used to arm the Home Guard. So the British Purchasing Commission basically cleared Colt's patent firearms of all of their existing stock, especially anything in .38 or .45. Some 14,000 commercial pistols were snatched up, not all of which were 1911s. But in the case of the 1911s, they don't seem to have been given any specific markings, though they would later receive British commercial proofs when they were discharged from service. Under the politically named Lend-Lease Act, signed in March of 1941, the US president was now permitted to sell, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of war-related materials to any government whose cause aided the defense of the United States. Basically, it got rid of the requirement that combatant nations pay cash up front and ship it themselves. Following this, another 78,625 Model 1911 and 1911 A1s were shipped to Britain. In 1943, just under 13,000 were also sent to the Soviet Union, though neither of these, nor other smaller foreign disbursements, are necessarily our topic for today. Now, as war was looming in Europe, the US had actually learned something from its hairy entry into the previous Great War. And in June of 1938, the Army Appropriations Act authorized funds for educational orders. These were small but expensive contracts to manufacturers who were not making defense-related items like, say, government pistols. The money was used to develop the tooling and experience to make such things, just in case it is needed later on. It's sort of a pre-boot. Bids were solicited, and 2 companies were chosen to participate in the program as pertains to the 1911 A1. The latter, by 6 days, was Harrington and Richardson. This firm was familiar with inexpensive firearms, but was not a producer of 1911-style automatic pistols. They were also in the middle of a bankruptcy plan. Contracted in April of 1940, they were given just shy of $200,000 to produce 500 1911 A1 pistols. The hope was, of course, to order more later, once they figured out what they were doing. The venture, however, failed, with the attempt ending in early 1942 with less than 15 pistols finished and absolutely none accepted by the government. The acquired machinery and tooling was put into a reserve pool for redistribution to others. More on that point in just a moment. The other recipient of an educational contract was Singer Manufacturing Company of Elizabeth, New Jersey. This firm was incorporated back in 1863 in New York. By 1873, they were making sewing machines in New Jersey. In 1940, they were the leading manufacturer of the same. Singer also received a contract to produce just 500 pistols with a deadline of May 1st, 1942. The total investment was $278,875.67. That's about $557.75 a pistol, give or take, but the equipment remained government property, just like what happened at H&R, so at least they held on something. Singer did complete their contract, producing excellent quality, parts interchangeable pistols, all while manufacturing everything but the stock plates in-house. Actually, those were bought from a company known as Keyes Fiber of New York City. Singer pistols are extremely rare today and valuable, as only 500 were ever made. They were given a do-light bluing and have plastic checkered stocks, made again by Keyes Fiber, though these are an early type with no escutcheon rings nor any internal supporting ribs. While manufacture was underway, they received a contract for another $15,000, but this had to be canceled. You see, pistol production was plagued with a low priority rating. Many felt that newer arms made the handgun kind of superfluous. This made manufacturers uneasy and meant procurement of machinery and raw materials was also difficult because everything was sort of being rationed at this point. Singer, with its massive facilities and excellent staff, was contracted out for artillery fire control directors, which was a much higher priority than pistols. So, like H&R, Singer's machinery, tooling, and other materials were recalled by the government for use elsewhere in the pistol program. More critically, however, Singer's drawings and production plans were actually successful. These would be handed over to the next 3 contenders, dramatically reducing their development time, though it wasn't perfect. Now, let's take a moment to discuss those plastic stocks, actually. Due to the high cost of producing wood stock plates, various plastics and aluminum were trialed as far back as 1931 by the US government. Bakelite had been approved back in 1933, but only as a substitute standard and never actually was put into use. Approval came again in 1939, and plastic started appearing in later 1940. Colt started this off with Colt rock, but these proved brittle and the formulation was changed to something called Colt wood. In either case, these were fiber-impregnated phenolic resin plastics. As production kicked off at other factories, those factories began purchasing their stock plates from a subcontractor called Keyes Fiber, like I said before, same as Singer had. Though now they actually had reinforced the inside of the stock plates. However, we're not really at that point in the story yet. For now, it's 1941, and Colt's Patent Firearms is the almost exclusive manufacturer of 1911 A1 pistols. Yeah, Singer would chew at their 500 units until the end of the year, but that was clearly going nowhere after they were done. So, a battle began on 2 fronts. First, Colt increased production as much as they could, and second, Ordnance scrambled to find other potential producers. Now, as part of Colt's hurry-up, they seem to have hit on a fast and effective means of coating these pistols that was not bluing. It was a manganese phosphate finish that had been in use by Rock Island Arsenal all the way back in 1918. Reworked Army pistols had been receiving the coating since 1936. While the dull gray wasn't very attractive, it was more durable, non-reflective, resisted salt spray, and its textured surface retained oil better. It first appeared at Colt's in May of 1941, becoming more common as time went on until it was the standard. The delay was because blue-prepped parts in production had to be matched for finish. There's no such thing as a half-park, half-blued gun. Now, all this mobilization is happening in a theoretically neutral nation. On December 7, 1941, however, that of course changed. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor snapped the tension clean, and the US shot into a war footing. With more units activated, the pistol shortage went critical. New suppliers must be found. Colt halted all non-government production until 1946, even converting unsold commercial guns over to government configuration and markings. In April of 1942, what would become the Pistol Industry Integration Committee met for the first time. Their task was to expand production as fast as possible while maintaining quality. Standardization as much as possible between contractors and subcontractors of the 1911 A1 pistol, parts, tools, processes, everything. The Remington UMC debacle of the Great War was not to be repeated. Subcontractors and raw materials were organized into pools from which major contractors could pull from with relative ease. Raw stock sizes were set on a hybrid between Colt's and Singer's improved practices, drawings were standardized, and the committee made sure everyone was in communication all the time. Based on regional ordnance district surveys, negotiations were begun with 3 new potential manufacturers: Remington Rand Corporation, Union Switch and Signal Company, and the Ithaca Gun Company. Each had their advantages, but the most successful of these, and the first one off the line, would be Remington Rand. A company that dates back to 1898, founded by James H. Rand in order to sell his visible name ledgers. Through his son, James Jr., the company expanded into all sorts of business organizational tools, including the 1926 acquisition of Remington Typewriter. Coincidentally, that company was a spin-off from E. Remington & Sons, precursor to the Remington Arms Company, but presently unrelated. Remington Rand was a major conglomeration with varied business units and factories displaying great skill at manufacture of all sorts. The U.S. Ordnance Department approached Remington Rand with a request to produce 125,000 pistols. Now, this number would actually rise after negotiations, and a contract was signed in May of 1942. Manufacture would take place at a mothballed typewriter factory, which was presently serving as storage in Syracuse, New York. Here they installed much of the government machinery and tooling that was left over from Singer's thwarted endeavor. This of course took lots of reworking, especially as Rand had never ventured into arms manufacture before. By the way, I should mention they, along with later producers, would also be supported by Remington Rand's own sister plants in Elmira and Ilion, New York, plus Bridgeport, Connecticut, which were capable of both small parts production and tool making. In order to get the ball rolling faster, they used a variety of parts from other manufacturers. 65,000 receiver forgings alone were provided to them. This is why, with Rand and others, we'll actually see early production examples sporting features from the other manufacturing lines, oftentimes out of date by, say, remaining blued up to a certain point. With the boost, they were able to deliver their first pistols in November of 1942, an impressive feat. However, they weren't perfect. Rejection rates climbed as Rand aggressively pushed for faster manufacture to meet deadlines. By February of 1943, the Pistol Committee's interchangeability test showed Rand was well behind. James Rand Jr. halted production from the middle of March through May of 1943 and replaced the general manager. He was assisted by Ordnance sending an aggressive and experienced resident inspector to help clear things up. By the end of the year, rejections were down to less than 5%, and it got better from there. All right, we finally made it to Remington Rand production, so I guess we can take a pause and get a look at a wartime 1911 A1. All right, we finally have a Remington Rand 1911 A1. And just for comparison's sake, here is a Colt from the war. This would have been a later brush blue. This is later for World War II as well, so we're sort of at the ends of both wars when production was fairly high, making these more accessible pieces for something like our show. Now, as you can tell at a glance, they're pretty much the same gun. We just have some refinements in how they're finished up and some small changes to the parts. You can see bluing is gone, parkerizing is in, wood is gone, plastic is in, and then there's some changes to various features, which we'll go ahead and start running on down. First things first though, because this is a Remington Rand, It has the initials FJA right here. That's for final inspection by that ordnance district. In this case, Frank J. Atwood would have been over top of Rand's location. This is going to be varied by the manufacturer and the ordnance district that was assigned to that manufacturer. Of course, we're marked Remington Rand, Inc., Syracuse, New York, USA. And if I flip this guy over, that's United States property with the serial number. And then it might be a little hard to make out, but that's M1911A1 U.S. Army on the frame. Not up on the slide, though many A1s were still marked 1911 without A1 on the slide. It's very, very faded on this gun, probably seen a rebuild at some point, but there is a crossed cannon ordnance mark here at the rear behind the grip. Now, these plastic grips were provided by Keystar Fiber. They're just a resin and fiber combination. They're kind of like a cousin to Bakelite, although much better and more long-lived. These actually rarely break, so good job, Keystar. Our triggers are, of course, different. Look at the extra length on the old 1911 versus the new A1. That's much further back. I'll also point out that we have these relief cuts here on either side of the frame. That's to make sure that you can get wrapped in on that trigger. Again, this shortening and these cuts are both designed to make sure that someone with a shorter finger can get good purchase. And if you have long hands like mine, well, you're always going to reach anyway, and you can still reach further back, unlike a short-fingered person that can't really reach at all in the forward position. Now, the original mainspring housings were straight with smooth backs. This guy is bulged out to make sure you choke up higher on the pistol and to prevent you from sort of aiming a little bit too low. This gets you to heel on up. And they would have been originally checkered. In this case, later in the war, it's actually serrated. Now, serrations were approved in April of 1943 for the mainspring housing. The hammer spur, the manual safety, and the slide stop. They were not always done by every factory, nor were they done all together. It's as parts ran out and subcontracted parts came in. And of course, it was all just to make it easier to manufacture more rapidly. This Rand pistol has a serrated slide stop, but it still has a technically checkered safety. I'm not sure how well you guys can make that out, but it appears to be pressed in checkering, which would have been faster than serrations anyway, just stomp it out. Now, in case you're curious, there are two types of serrated mainspring housing. This guy with 8 ribs would have been made in-house by Rand. Cayuga Motors was a subcontractor for both Ithaca and Colt. They have one less ridge on the backstrap. If we compare our 1911 and A1 again, we'll see, look at this extended grip safety. I mean, that's sticking much further out. And yeah, the original hammer is overhanging much further, so the spur is longer than the now 1911 A1. But also, check out this dimension here. As we come out versus as we come out, this hammer is slightly shorter in length, let alone the extension of the spur. This goes all the way back to the length of the original as adopted 1911s, but more by coincidence of working themselves backwards into a better position. This extended hammer came about shortly after the adoption of 1911. You can learn more about that in our other lesson, because of wanting to get more leverage on the hammer when thumb cocking. So it ultimately led to, I mean, look at that, that's a pinchy nightmare in there. This is a lot easier on the hand. Now, you may also note that this is a flat-sided hammer, and this one has a spur. Or that's to say it has wings off the side of its spur. This is uniform in width and therefore faster than manufacturer. This was recommended by the Pistol Committee and was actually approved of in July of 1942. So it was almost always a feature of Remington Rands and some other manufacturers, except for the fact that they did purchase some parts that were left over from Colt's production or overproduction from Colt for their early assemblage of pistols. But a sort of true general manufactured Rand would have always had this World War II improvised hammer of just going ahead and milling it out and losing some of that extra thumb pad. Just looking at these two pistols, you can tell this is a dull Parkerized finish. This is and was in some spots a blue, not necessarily a bright blue. This would have actually been a brush blue from late in the war, but still much shinier, thinner coated, has a blue hue to it, and generally very smooth surface. This is a more porous, sort of textured, filmy surface that holds onto oil, and it's in a gray phosphate color. That's because it is a phosphate process. But when did this happen? Well, it actually happened during the war. So the original A1s would have inherited bluing left over from the 1911s, a Colt commercial blue, which at the start of commercial production by various manufacturers, going into early 1942, it was agreed upon that everybody was going to do what was called do-lite bluing, D-U-L-I-T-E. And yet, by October of 1942, that was thrown out the window and parkerizing was standard. This is much more robust and much more serviceable and apparently fairly easy to apply without having to do any special final polishing. Parkerizing ends up being a very smart decision on the part of U.S. Ordnance. Take a look at the discoloration on this slide. There's a half circle here and then everything front of that looks just a little bit shinier. That's because the slide is not evenly heat treated. Instead, a second pass is made to specifically harden around the slide stop and the whole front of the slide where of course there's a lot going on, and yet you don't want to lose the elasticity that's at the rear because you don't want that shattering from being too hard. Now I'm told this was a process in which they heated up to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit and then oil quenched and tempered back for 30 minutes. I'm not sure what temperature they tempered. And then prior to 1942, this discoloration to the finish, even though the process was already in play, at least for the front, this process, or rather this discoloration, would have been buffed out in the finish. You wouldn't have seen it, and if you could see it, they probably would have DQ'd the pistol and had it refinished. Of course, in the war, who cares? It'll look how it looks, just get them out, it's hardened, it's working, it's not rusting. So this was allowed to just pass through inspection after that point. Now the slide stop location hardening actually didn't start until around May of 1943 at Colt's Patent Firearms, and I'm not sure if that was started to be applied universally or not, but you may see earlier war guns or pre-war guns that of course don't have this additional hardening spot. Especially pre-war, they would have been buffed out to hide it anyway. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a pre-war Colt, so essentially there's two steps removed between these sights. We have a tapered front sight, and if you look closely, you can see it's coming up towards a point, it doesn't become a point. And then we have just a half-moon front sight, in theory, would have been the middle position. And then you take that same half-moon front sight and you cut serrations in the back so it kind of makes it a little straighter and it reduces glare, and this is what you've got. So no taper at the top, taper at the top, and then later on serrated at the back to reduce glare. The initial 1911 A1 rear sight would have looked almost identical to this one, only ever so slightly more opened up. It would still be a round bottom notch. If you look at this guy, you can see we have a lot more relief in here to let more light in, and then from this angle it can be hard to tell, but it is a square bottomed notch. You know what, I actually have two pictures that we can use to show you guys that difference now from the shooter's perspective. The squared up notch and squared up front sight align much quicker together and therefore provide more rapid target acquisition. It's not as fine if you want to do distance shooting, but this is a handgun. Now the square cut sight was approved in April of 1942. Now there are a number of steps in the progression of the 1911 magazine, this being a late war two-tone that is not cut at the rear for any kind of relief because the hardening was working pretty well, and yet we still see some cracking. We almost always do on these very rigid magazines. A lot of people take for granted how much the quality of steel improved between the two world wars because this is just a straight blued magazine from World War II manufacturer, and there's no need to do any special hardening or craziness, and they tend to survive a lot better than their older brethren. I'm not sure how easy it is for you guys to make out, but there is a little S on the top of the toe. This one was made by the subcontractor Scoville. Most magazines during the war would be subcontracted. Now at great personal risk, I have gone ahead and pinned out these springs down the mags and released the followers so we can see down in. I could let these out, but then it's going to take me forever to get these back together, so you guys are going to have to squint for a second, because on the A1, right here, we have a beautiful wire loop that's been added. See how it's not present in the old 1911? That's providing more rigid support at the front of the bullet, which is making sure we get a good feed. Disassembly of the pistol is the same as it was on the 1911, so I've skipped that process to speed us up and just pulled out the recoil spring. Now, the 1911 A1 is at the bottom. You can see it's just about 3 coils shorter, and if you're able to pick it up, it's slightly thinner. So compression on this versus compression on this, I'm getting a lot further with the same general force. This is lighter sprung. The barrel's much the same as it ever was. I just want to point out that little high standard mark, HS. They made probably the most barrels of the war, supplying them to basically everyone. Colt also made their own barrels in-house, and then God help you if you got a Springfield barrel, because those were apparently of the lowest quality with a failure rate of like 95% for some batches. They were doing their best, but their best wasn't good enough. Despite all the changes, the 1911 A1 is not functionally different from the previous 1911, so I recommend you review our prior lesson on this topic if you'd like to know more about the inner workings of one of these big bore pistols. So that just leaves us to watch a demonstration by our own May. Now let's all thank May for preparing these ahead of time. It would be quite loud here in the classroom otherwise. Now, Remington Rand would turn out to be the government's best friend in pistol production. Despite a rough start, their engineers and inspectors took their job very seriously. Not only did they refine their product, they also actively investigated improvements for production. They took the Singer straight line method and, thanks to their manufacturing experience, wrung every bit of efficiency out of the process. No buckets of stuff being pushed back and forth, straight from machine A through Z in order. They also developed heat treatments, broaching methods, and fixtures that came to be standard across the whole of production with all manufacturers. All right, let's rewind a bit. Remington Rand was brought on, but what about the others? Let's talk Union Switch and Signal, who were also contracted in May of 1942, technically just ahead of Remington Rand. Founded by George Westinghouse in 1882, Union Switch and Signal was a subsidiary of Westinghouse Air Brake Company, responsible for the production of railroad switches and signals. I mean, that's in the name. During the Great War, they had produced rotary engines, shells, projectiles, and rifle parts, so they had some experience in rapid-scale manufacture. Their initial contract was for 200,000 pistols. Like Rand, Union Switch and Signal was serious. They sent 12 men to Colts for training while they tooled up their factory in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Soon, pre-production trials of receivers, slides, and other pistols were underway. Full serial production was ongoing in January of 1943, with 102 pistols accepted by ordnance that same month, which is exactly when the US government moseyed on in and advised them they'd be cutting the contract down soon from 200,000 pistols to just 30,000 pistols. Thanks for your effort, boys. Estimated pistol manufacture had caught up with demand, especially because of the scale of Remington Rand's operation. As consolation, they were offered a subcontract on parts for the M1 carbine. This was signed February 11th, and on March 8th, the pistol contract was officially reduced. By June of 43, the 30,000 1911 A1s were almost done, so personnel and equipment were transferred to other tasks or let go. This is when the government wandered back in the door and said, whoopsie doodle, Remington Rand halted production for a few months there, so we're short on pistols again, can you do another 25,000? Which Union still managed to actually do, though it took some time to reorient again. The last of these were shipped November 27th of 1943. They were well-built, high-quality pistols right from the start, though they did suffer two problems that needed correction. Some turned up with cracked slides, which proved to be too soft and lacked the strengthening fillets that were in the corners of the ejection port. Faulty inspection and bad gauges also led their disconnector dimensions astray. Both of these matters were easily corrected once they were discovered. Now, I must point out that, to my knowledge, this Union switch and signal pistol should have been blued from the factory, as they left manufacture before Parkerization was enforced upon them. It's likely that this was refinished later on in service. Union Switch and Signal also contributed to the overall cause by developing a special firing range that was implemented at other facilities, and they devised a system for better forecasting production, which the Pistol Committee took to the rest of the manufacturers. Even after Union Switch and Signal's production was halted, they provided over 73,000 frame forgings to our next producer, the Ithaca Gun Company. Founded in 1880 by Leroy H. Smith, formerly of L.C. Smith, Ithaca Gun Company was established along Fall Creek in Ithaca, New York. Its bread and butter was sporting shotguns. Incorporated in 1903, Ithaca acquired Lefevre Arms in 1916 and all of Western Arms Corporation stock in 1931. Despite being the last to produce our pistol, Ithaca was amongst the first to try. Ithaca's management was fairly nervous about getting involved in wartime manufacture. They had seen it balloon and then bust many times over for other competitors, but at the Ordnance Department's coaching, they did apply to the educational program in 1940. Their cautious nature, however, meant that they were late to the party, and the program was already closed to entry. In early 1941, Ithaca received a large number of 1911 parts from Colts, who had in turn received them as surplus from Springfield Armory, who had in turn received them from Remington UMC. The hope was that Ithaca could remanufacture them for Colt's use, but being from Remington UMC, they were way out of spec and not worth the cost. Meanwhile, they were contracted for 12,433 riot guns. A portion of these were also fitted with bayonets. In January of 1942, Ordnance invited Ithaca to bid on production of the 1911 A1. They were awarded a contract for 60,000 units once they did so. Ithaca put 3 of their buildings to work and leased another for material storage. They received the majority of equipment left over from Harrington and Richardson's failed bid at production. This was unfortunately incomplete. Ithaca, however, had little experience with tooling and equipment procurement on this scale. The Pistol Committee decided that instead of training a whole team at Ithaca on these matters, they would just assign responsibility to Remington Rand, whose sister plants were capable of making most of what Ithaca would need anyway. Ithaca, as a private company, believed Rand would give them lower priority than their own plant, so friction began to build. The Rochester Ordnance District was soon harried by negotiations between the two firms, and frankly, regretted the decision to put one commercial firm in charge of procurement for another. Also, if getting used to H&R's tooling, which was a failed line, I remind you, plus being supplied by your competitor wasn't enough, the other source of equipment for Ithaca was Springfield Armory, who happily sent along more of that tainted UMC mess. Poor Ithaca had to significantly rework some of these machines, which always required permission in writing lest they get entangled in legal matters for molesting government-owned equipment that doesn't even work right. Because of these delays, Ithaca was provided 6,200 surplus unfinished receivers from Springfield Armory. These were World War I leftovers and thankfully largely from Colt's earlier production. Ithaca also purchased over 7,000 receivers and 2,000 slides directly from modern-day Colt. 60 pistols were completed in December of 1942, which is kind of a miracle, but the last of the equipment wasn't in place until March of 1943, which makes more sense. Full production began in July. By August, though, it was found the rejection rate was too high. The production schedule was cut back and engineering changes were, of course, made by the Ordnance Department. The number of final inspectors was doubled in order to prevent further problems. A particular issue with trigger creep was found to be caused by a tolerance stack, leading to interference between the trigger and grip safety. Quality thankfully improved, though Ordnance ultimately felt that Ithaca did not put forth the same effort as the other two producers. Their general manager, Harry E. Howland, however, did design a radically simplified trigger. The concept is simple. Why make a milled trigger when a stamped one would be a lot more affordable? And if you look at these, you can tell, yeah, there are some differences. Specifically back behind the trigger itself, you can really see, oops, sorry guys, they're very light and awkward to hold in such a way that you can see, hold on, there we go, that's a little bit better. You can see that, yeah, this is a bunch of folded steel pinched together and then pressed from the sides. You can see the little dimples from that, whereas this has all been milled out and therefore takes a lot more time. Now, this is just a trigger I had laying around. It's not necessarily World War I or II vintage, but it is milled and it can show you the difference. Now, the cost of the stamp trigger was radically reduced. We are talking about going from $1.85 to just 20 cents. So this was obviously approved, and that was in August of 1942. Now, it can be a little hard to make out on these guys, but another change was approved in September of 1943, which is right here at this top edge. There's a little bit of a notch. Not there, there. That little notch was to eliminate some interference from the legs of the sear on the back of the trigger bow. Now, these triggers would be produced by Yeoman Metal Products of Rochester, New York. They replaced the standard milled triggers for all the producers as each ran out of stock on hand. Curiously, Ithaca seems to have made more use of serrated parts later in production than the other manufacturers. Supposedly, some small number of Remington Rands ended up with serrated safeties, though there is some debate on that matter, but only Ithaca is known to have used serrated hammer spurs, which were produced by Wright Engineering Company for Ithaca. And while we're discussing subcontractors, let's get a better look at that situation. We've already seen that Keyes Fiber made grips. High Standard made barrels, along with, for a time, the Springfield Armory, whose machinery was then turned over to Flannery Bolt Company. Yeoman Metal made triggers. Humason Manufacturing did springs and lanyard loops. They actually largely replaced Wallace Barnes, who had done the same. Remington Rand used plants to produce various small parts for some of the other producers as well. Magazines were produced by the same consortium of three companies we saw back in the Great War: M.S. Little, Risden, and Scoville Manufacturing. If that last one isn't familiar, it's because they merged with the previous supplier. All told, 7,667,678 magazines were shipped by just these three companies. Even so, a contract was let out to General Shaver, another division of Remington Rand that had made electric shavers. They produced another 1.5 million field replacement magazines, which can be recognized by their spot-welded spines. Towards the end of the war, even Colt was using as many subcontract parts as possible for more rapid and inexpensive manufacture. Even so, the pace wasn't always full throttle. By rough estimation, here are each year's production numbers as a percentage of the total made during the course of the war. The point is to show how that ramp up was somewhat slow before a double-digit pace in 1943, a banner year in 44, and this big reduction in 45, which was entirely intentional. Okay, so Singer was a one-and-done trial. Switch and Signal just wrapped with 55,000 units. Their contract had been canceled in August of 1943. Remington Rand was told to pack it in July of 1945. Ordnance had enough in the line to keep things running, and they had promises elsewhere. Only Colt's Patent Firearms and the Ithaca Gun Company were kept running until the end of the war. They only halted after contracts were terminated on September 2nd, the official Victory in Japan Day. So, during the course of the arm-up and the war itself, how did we do? Despite being the original producer of the 1911 A1, Colt's Patent Firearms wasn't the biggest of the war. They had other guns to make anyway. So they managed just 575,632 total 1911 A1s. Remington Rand, which never lost its focus on mass manufacture, managed 877,751 units shipped, an astonishing achievement. Ithaca managed a respectable 335,466 pistols, and Union Switch and Signal got the old bait and switch, so they only made 55,000. Singer, who was on a scholarship, remains the rarest at 500 total units, that was intentional. That means a grand total of 1,844,349 1911 A1 pistols for the Second World War. Now, I haven't said much on the topic of serial numbers, mostly because I don't want to keep you here all day. Frankly, for that sort of resolution, you're going to want to check out a book like Clawson's Colt 45 Service Pistols Models of 1911 and 1911 A1. What I will say is that U.S. Ordnance attempted to prevent serial overlap by assigning various sequential ranges to each manufacturer. Unfortunately, in handing off some authority from Springfield Armory over to the Office of the Chief of Ordnance, someone made a little mistake. It's a lot to explain in detail, but 106,171 serial numbers were duplicated across several manufacturers. Whoops. Turning back to the inventor of the 1911 A1 humped mainspring, William Holmes Wenstrom transferred to the Signal Corps in 1927. There he served as a tour instructor in English at West Point and attended summer school at Harvard. He studied communications engineering at the Sheffield Scientific School of Yale University and meteorology at the California Institute of Technology. He was also a frequent contributor to technical journals on radio and aviation science. He later became a meteorological control officer. He retired from military service in 1937 with the rank of major. From here, he mostly wrote on the topic of meteorology. His book, Weather and the Ocean of Air, was published, unfortunately, posthumously. That's because both he and his wife were killed in a shootout on April 4th of 1942. That day, he was quarreling on his own porch with another retired major over specifics of the California Home Guards drill. Apparently, this somehow erupted into gunfire, with Wenstrom struck twice near the heart and his wife through the jaw and palate. His opponent, Buell Hammett, was hit in the right hip and suffered a slow and painful recovery. A county grand jury found his homicide justifiable as it was the result of self-defense. Just a few years later, however, Hammett ended up taking his own life. Marcellus Rambo lived out his last years in Rio de Janeiro, still a dentist by trade. He passed of heart failure in February of 1945. Overall, U.S. Ordnance rated the 1911 A1 as vastly superior to the 1911. It was considered rugged and reliable, inspiring confidence in the men who carried it. I don't think I need to probe reports to tell you all just how beloved it was. In the American consciousness, I don't think any other firearm takes such a central position. And sure, there's a lot of love out there for the Springfield, or the Garand, or the handy M1 carbine, but each of these is instantly compared to the others. For the 1911, even by World War II, there were few competitors in its category. The upgrade to A1 may have been icing on the cake. Now, unfortunately, for the 1911 A1, it continued to serve for far too long, not by design, mind you, but by actual physical service. Those impressive manufacturing numbers meant that the US government didn't need to make a single purchase of an additional 1911 A1 all the way until the pistol was replaced in the 1980s. Even then, it wasn't kicked out immediately. That means service through Korea, Vietnam, and a bit beyond. These guns were worn, reaching the end of their expected operational lives, or perhaps exceeding it. This earned them, for a time, a very poor reputation, though not necessarily a deserved one. Well, this one isn't exactly fresh either, so let's go ahead and take it and put it back in May's hand and find out how she felt firing it. All right, we've made room for May.
Hello.
And we have two 1911s, one of which is an A1.
It's this one.
Yeah, I've got the old one. You've got the new one. Let's go through it. So we've covered a lot of 1911s. You've shot a lot of 1911s.
No.
Just for this lesson plan, what have we had? We've had 3 of the World War I guys. We've had a Norwegian. Oh, and then another one. We had the 455. And then I think so, just for the lessons. Off camera, you've shot Series 70s, Series 80s, 38 Supers, all sorts of stuff.
Fun stuff.
Let's talk these two, though, and just delete all of our knowledge of the 1911s. And this is very critical. A lot of you have knowledge of 1911s from a modern competitive or sporting or, plus upgraded 1911. I don't know what to call this anymore. Customized in some way. These are military 1911s. Yes, they have linear triggers, but they don't have stone polished sears that are, they have a little bit of cliff.
And some heavy use potential.
A lot of that. So, in that context, you have handled the beautiful, blued, heavy-duty 45 of World War I vintage, right?
Correct.
All right. And then deleting all of their 1911 knowledge, you are going straight from that to the A1.
Okay.
What stands out to you above all else?
Well, 2 things immediately stand out when I go to hold it is that, one, there is an actual good grip change between the two because this one, I guess, is bulging back out here at the rear.
Yeah,
They've included some serrated what is it, a notch, or what do they call
They're
this?
just serrations.
Okay.
So they would have been checkered originally as the first A1s, but according to the ordnance files that I have access to, the first suggestion of the bulging of the mainspring was called a hump. So hump is the technical term.
A serrated hump. Cool. And then the other thing that I noticed with it is that it feels like, and it is true, this grip safety is longer out the backside.
Yeah. You have an extended tang.
Yes.
And does that...
Very comfortable by comparison, I will say. It really follows the contours of the human hand well.
It feels like with the A1, the bulged mainspring housing and the extended beaver tail, you end up in a position where it pulls you into the center line a little faster. So if you try to drop your hand in on this one...
That's actually what I was doing. I was dropping my hand a little bit to see it, and no, it feels like it wants to naturally pull me up into it better.
What happens if you try to set your hand a little too low on that one?
I can, and it doesn't feel unnatural.
Okay.
That's a bit unfortunate. It's not something you think about either, but no, he's not wrong. I can drop my hand lower on the grip itself, and it doesn't feel all that weird.
Right. Now,
whereas with this one, it definitely feels unnatural to drop it lower. It wants you tied up in there.
when it comes to the beaver tail, do you get the skin over top like I do?
No, I have noticed that some people do end up getting that kind of hammer bite
hands.
because their skin will fold over a little bit.
Mine does it so well that I have a permanent scar right there from shooting early 1911s.
You do, and I've never had that problem, so it's a little bit wasted on me, but I could see how if they had enough reports come in that they went, oh, okay, let's just push this a little further out.
You do get one advantage on the longer beaver tail, even if you don't have the skin wraparound problem, which is that as you come in, you have a higher plane at which you can catch this and drop in better.
That's true.
If you're
That
coming
is
up from the
nicer.
holster.
Yeah.
So that is nice. Original mainspring housing, of course, uncheckered, nice and smooth back here. A lot of people comment that the bulge in the mainspring is to provide better support to the hand. That is it in a way, but really the core issue was people were not necessarily choking up high enough on the guns, and they had a tendency to shoot low, and putting the bulge there gave you some physical feedback that told you get up higher, and then it gave you the support to make sure you're not hitting low because it's pushing out the bottom of the gun a little bit more. That cleaned up things for people very nicely on training. Now, a lot of people prefer straight mainspring housing because they've put a lot of hours in on their gun and they just like it that way. That's fine. You already know where to grab your gun.
I was just looking at the grip for or the magazine for a second.
Yeah, they are slightly different, not in a way that matters very much. It's the two-tone versus that straight bluing. The steel and treatment quality had been a lot better by the time of World War II.
Okay.
These, frankly, people underestimate the difference in steel between World War I and World War II. These were a lot more
Totally
flimsy.
different area.
And it's got that cyanide hardening at the end to try to keep those feed lips in good shape. And there's still some cracking on this example and almost every example that's been used.
Now, there was something I did actually notice very quickly when we went to go shoot this A1. I noticed that the slide spring on this was so much nicer than the 1911, because we actually shot both of them the same day for the same shoot. So it was kind of fun to go from, oh, I feel like I'm really powering through this, I'm getting a good job, to come to this one and be like, man, I must have strengthened up in the middle of takes. That was awesome. But it certainly is much nicer for me to rack.
Yes, they have reduced the coils, and the number of coils is down, the diameter of the wire is down. It is much easier to rack that slide than it is on the original.
I did like that. I like that change up.
All right, so you've got it racked in, you've got your new grips, you've got your, the whole grip has changed because of the mainspring.
Right, it feels different.
You don't thumb your hammer.
No.
But would you just thumb that hammer back real quick for me? No, like in your hand, yeah, like one-handedly.
I mean, I have to reach around. I have to break my grip pretty good on that.
Okay, what about this hammer, which has a big wide spur on it?
Oh. Well, that one is arguably nicer, easier to touch on.
So would you say you don't like the flattened out hammers that were just...
I don't think I like it as much, no.
To be fair, they were only done that way for more rapid manufacture. It's not supposed to be superior in any way.
Okay, I was wondering about that.
Okay, so hammers back, you're lining up your sights, I guess is where we're at now.
Okay, and then, oh nice, so we have essentially a blocky Berthier rear sight style, with just a square cut, with a... You know what? I'm going to say that front sight's definitely looking better. It's a squared up front, whereas before we had, it was like a tapered to a top square for the front sight.
Yeah, so your front sight was like a half coin, like just a half moon sight, tapered.
It's very bright.
Towards a point. It doesn't come to a point, but it's tapered towards a point. Very bright, shiny. And then your rear sight was a U-notch.
Oh yeah, the U-notch, that's right. I prefer these because these are a much cleaner read, I would say. And then on top of that, I really like that front sight because They've got serrations on here that make it nice and dark too. Like it really does hide away that light. It's nice.
So your earliest A1s, actually most of the A1s up until I think 1942, I'd have to check our lesson plan. They would have had a half moon front sight. However, instead of being tapered, it would just be squared up.
Okay.
And then they would have opened up the rear notch a little bit more. That's it. It still would have been a round rear notch.
Gotcha.
Then all of a sudden you have this square back with it's still a half moon, but what they've done is they've come back and they've serrated the backside in order to reduce glare beautifully. It stands,
well done. I like it.
From the shooter's perspective, it's just a rectangle. It looks just like a rectangle.
It's a very clean, quick read.
The rear sight itself, just to point it out here, has it's been wallowed out more on the 42 version. So, I keep saying 42, but I'm going off of memory here. I'll correct myself later. But the point is, during the war, they actually reduced the amount of metal that was right at the aperture of the rear sight so that it let in more light.
Gotcha.
And they squared it up.
Okay.
So it's a finer rear sight. It seems to work a lot better to my eye to quickly pick up a target.
Same here. I enjoyed it much better.
All right, so then you go to pull the trigger.
The trigger is now further back than what it was before. That was certainly different. And you know what? I'm going to say it fits better with my hand, with where my trigger finger wants to settle. Like it is arguably right there so that I'm at a nice 90-degree angle. Where does it settle for you? Because I'm wondering. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I bet you like the extended trigger.
I hate it. So I actually have my own personal 1911. That's not this one. And I have a trigger that is easily a quarter inch, if not more, further forward. That is custom fit into it because my hand is big enough, and what I want is I want to be here at 90 degrees. And I want to just pull back with the first two knuckles a little bit and just go. I don't want to have to wrap around because if you have a larger hand and you have to wrap in there, you're moving your whole finger to pull that trigger, which the checkering that's now been added to the front of the trigger becomes important with that, so I don't slip off.
There is a little bit of checkering, yeah. It's very faint, but it's there.
Well, there's a stamp trigger too.
Oh, okay.
The earlier ones would have had more pronounced checkering.
And then I was just pulling through gently and letting the hammer fall forward slightly a little bit so I could feel it. But it's a little bit of take up and then cliff wall. It's a little bit spongy though, I noticed that wall. And I wasn't really a fan of the sponginess. But then again, I know this isn't like competition style setup trigger. It's supposed to be amazing. It's been through a lot. It's seen a lot in its time. So
technically, actually being fired more probably would have softened it up.
Oh, good. Okay.
But I'm going to tell you, between these two, overall, I tend to prefer the earlier ones.
Yeah, I can see that.
I don't know if it's just the finish of wartime or what, but the triggers always seem to be slightly better in terms of the mechanics of these guys. However, that gun is suffering from age.
It definitely is. But I will say the finish on the outside is sticking around much better than the previous is.
Yeah, Parkerizing kicks butt.
Yeah, it really
it's not very pretty, but it works. This gun's much older, but this is the thing. It seems to me that the 1911s that are still around, the World War I era guys, tend to be in better shape than the World War II era guns because the World War II era guns stayed in inventory and kept getting recycled into duty roles or training roles or whatever the case may be. And so I think
they continued their heavy use essentially is what he's saying. I'm
going to tell you, life expectancy for 1911 is like 7,500 rounds for the A1. I don't know what it was for the 1911. But I'm going to guess most 1911s never saw that number. And I'm going to guess many, many, many 1911 A1s exceeded that number.
Oh, yeah.
And were rebuilt. We see signs of that all throughout the ones that have come out of the Army many years later. So it's fun to think, but you've only got 20 years between this and the heyday of that. And really only like 4 years between the development. But from World War II until they released in like 80s, 90s, 2000s that they're still leaking out of the Army, like, yeah, they got rode hard that's double the distance before they start kicking out. And granted, these were still around, but they weren't trying to put pure 1911s on frontline. They were rebuilding them as A1s if they're going to use them at all. Anyway, that's a whole side story. Point being, given the hardware, the Parkerization seems to do much, much better. Parkerization just doesn't seem to wear off and scratch nearly as bad. This was a brush blue gun, and it's almost completely gone off the slide.
Yeah.
The frame is holding on to it pretty well, but you can see every bump and bruise it's had along the way.
I think that's it for changes really between the two. I will say for the most part, with maybe the exception of the shape of the hammer, I'm pretty into a lot of the changes they've made.
Do you prefer the mainspring housing to be arched like that?
What do you mean?
Like the bulge at the rear?
Oh yeah, I absolutely do.
Okay.
We talked about that before, literally at the very beginning of all this.
I can't make up my mind. I've gone back and forth on it. I think I still prefer straight mainspring housing.
I mean, you can be wrong, but that's fine.
Overall, how would you rate the 1911 A1?
Solid change, solid improvements. Definitely better than its predecessor. I don't know what you want rating style, if we want me to do a 1 out of 100.
In the context of World War II, which we have not done a lot of pistols from, and May has not actually shot a ton of World War II pistols, would you still rank it as a confidence-inspiring handgun in the Second World War?
Yeah, definitely. I could see this being one that people would certainly be willing to defend themselves with.
There's really only a couple designs that start to chase the 1911 in that period, and they do it in 9mm, and therefore you start to get in this argument of 9 versus 45. And for people that like big bore, 1911 remained unreplaceable well beyond World War II.
I could see why.
And if you take out the bore argument, it's still an extremely reliable and rugged handgun that set the standard for every other handgun to come. So yeah, I'm going to say as a design, it's well less. I mean, the Luger's looking long. This is up against the Luger for the most part. And the Luger's long in the tooth by World War II.
Yeah, I would agree.
They set it aside during World War II for good reason. This is still going. All right, well,
That's
overall,
pretty much everything, I think.
I think that wraps our lesson. I just have you guys' little extra credit question.
Ooh.
This time around is, do you think that the 1911 A1 is materially superior to the 1911 in all of its features and regards? And if you disagree with any of the improved features between these, this guy to that guy, then let us know what you would not have changed. All right, I think that has this lesson wrapped up.
It does.
Just in time. Y'all have a good one.
Bye.
Today's lesson was made possible thanks to support from our friends over at LSB Auctions. Though it's a bit tangential, they hooked us up with our buddy Kurt, and Kurt hooked us up with a lot of 1911s that we could take photos of, so we really appreciate it. Also, this episode is executively produced quite a while ago, actually, by our friend Tom Batha, so we really appreciate that because without such support, it really would be impossible to keep the show going. You can be a man of his caliber by coming over to Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can join us there to get your study guides and other lesson materials, plus the behind the scenes office hours podcast. You get the idea. All right, y'all, have a good one.